Give us a sense of what the scope of your research entailed.
Well, what Steve Scotchpole and I are reporting on in the article that you've read is really coming at the confluence of two very different approaches to research. So she's been doing some research based on site visits and questionnaires and outreach in multiple places, sort of non-big cities in North Carolina, Wisconsin, Ohio, and Northeast Pennsylvania. And meanwhile, I've been involved in doing sort of participant observation and some organizing and about 2 to 3 dozen interviews, largely in the Southwest Pennsylvania area. And what we discovered when we began talking back and forth is that we were finding exactly the same patterns, almost identical quotes, coming from especially women who had sort of come to the forefront as organizers in all of these places. And it was really the consistency of the stories that we were hearing from our very different research approaches that made us think that we were onto something here.
And so when you set out to both, perform your respective research modus operandi, are you talking to, well, one, do you start with some type of thesis question? Like, what were you was this just basically, I'm going to go out into the field and see what's going on? And if that's the case, how do you determine what communities you're going to go into, which people you're going to approach? And what were the sort of the guiding principles, or what was the fundamental question you were looking to answer?
Well, it's interesting because, again, the answer is different for each of us, and yet what we found was pretty similar. So in her case, her research team was particularly interested in looking at places that seemed to, within states that seemed to have swung sort of unexpectedly towards Trump in the last election. And so they weren't actually setting out to find any kind of resistance at all. They were setting out to find what local political life looked like in these sort of heartland spaces and these Rust Belt spaces that seem to have performed in unexpected ways in the 2016 election. And yet what they found, surprising them, was this sort of upsurge of local organizing. My story was really different. I began first just although I'm professionally a historian, I'm also a citizen and sometimes organizer here in Pittsburgh. So I just began, as I was participating in some sort of local political discussions in the wake of the November 16 election, I began seeing this pattern of activism within Southwest Pennsylvania that looked really different from what I was hearing about on the national media, which is to say, again and again, it was middle-aged women in the suburbs rather than in the city, which of course has Pittsburgh is a city where my own precinct voted maybe 92% for Hillary Clinton. So Pittsburgh as a city is a very heavily Democratic space. That wasn't where I was seeing change happening in the wake of the 2016 election. It was precisely in these suburban areas that had been electing Republicans, and in some cases only Republicans, for multiple electoral cycles. That's where I saw new groups emerging, and I wanted to figure out what was going on.
I mean, that's interesting, and I've certainly. We've seen some reporting to this effect on some level, particularly print, and the concept. Obviously, it's I guess it's more obvious in the context of places that would have voted for Trump to see this change occur. And before we get into sort of what your research found, the reason why that occurs to me, which is I guess more ancillary to your research than addressing it in some ways, is that I can say from someone who lives in Brooklyn that to the extent that I could see a change from what I had seen in sort of locally in terms of politics is the emergence of a similar demographic that you're talking about who became even more activated. So it is people who probably who already voted for Hillary Clinton, or maybe just didn't even bother to vote, not necessarily a surprise, but they were organizing and sending money to essentially the people that you came out and spoke to. So let's start with your people, and we can address that dynamic in a bit. But what was it? You say that you and your fellow writer, Theda Skobel, found a similar dynamic. What was that dynamic?
So the dynamic is really strikingly an organizational story. So it's not just an ideological story. It's not a story just about enthusiasm or energy at the grassroots, but rather about, in place after place, local people coming together usually in January and February of 2017. Again and again, there are stories that where the sort of nucleus of organizing might come out of, for instance, women who joined together to charter a bus to go to D.C. or to go to one of their near state capitals for protests on for the Women's March, or in other cases, people who hadn't participated in the Women's March, and but were stepping forward in the wake of Trump's election to say, what can we do? Something is broken. I sort of sometimes the image that I have and that sort of captures both the demographic and the vibe that you would get from people is imagining, the woman who has, a long list on the refrigerator of like getting the kids through their homework, making sure the science project materials are bought, and people just added on to that long list of things they had to get done on the refrigerator, save democracy, because people sort of had this sense that they had thought that there were grown-ups in charge, and all of a sudden they looked around and realized no one was in charge, or that there weren't the structures in place to ensure sort of the basics of procedural democracy happening all around them. And what's striking, again, when I say it's an organizational story, what probably makes places like the suburbs that we're talking about, where the change has been most radical, different from places like Brooklyn, as you're describing it, is that in many of these areas, especially outside of big cities, the Democratic Party as an institution on the ground has really almost disappeared over the course of the last generation. So again, and you see this both in terms of whether candidates are getting fielded for things like state legislative positions, school board positions. Again and again, you hear stories. We've been told stories from and watched these groups looking around them and realizing that there hadn't been a Democratic candidate for school board run as far as anyone could remember, or that they had a state representative who was a Republican who'd run unopposed in the last 3 cycles. And people stepped forward and said, that's not possible. We've got to be able to find someone to run for that. And in some cases, they looked around and found a sort of small existing local Democratic Party, sometimes with some of the stalwarts of that might be people in their 80s who'd been members and sort of trying to keep the local Democratic Party institutions going for the last 30 or 40 years. In some cases, you see there weren't even that. There were sort of empty committee seats. And in some cases, people sort of tried to work within those Democratic Party structures, and in other cases, they just created their own structures. They came up with their own name, often a nonpartisan name. So we have things like the Voice of Westmoreland, or the names of PT, Citizens for Democracy. That's another phrase that people often adopt. And they recruited candidates for a whole bunch of local offices for which people hadn't run before. And they started doing on-the-ground electoral organizing, so doing door-to-door organizing, door-to-door canvassing throughout the 2017 electoral cycle leading up to November 2017. So in the places where you really hadn't had a Democratic electoral presence, that's where you've seen this really significant shift in the sort of the creation or the recreation of a local layer of the Democratic Party.
It's fascinating. All right, Lara, we got to take a break, but when we come back, I want to talk about a little bit more specifically about the demographic that we're talking about. I mean, I think it's quite clear that we're talking, about around the neighborhood of middle-aged women, many of whom are college educated, suburban, often white, and I want to talk about this, the sort of the dynamic of a couple of things. One being the notion that this is not ideological per se. It's ostensibly about sort of the democratic process, but it appears as in the context of the Democratic Party. And I also want to talk about an interesting dynamic that we see play out in ideological battles, but it's the story of these grassroots groups shunned of ideology, but butting up against the establishment of the Democratic Party. We got to take a quick break. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. We'll be right back with Lara Putnam right after this.